In Las Vegas, alarm clocks didn't just wake tourists for breakfast. They woke them for atomic bombs. Guests climbed hotel rooftops before dawn to watch mushroom clouds rise in the desert. Casinos leaned into it, selling atomic cocktails and hosting blast viewing parties. By today's eyes, it sounds insane, but back then, it felt like the thrill of the future. Los Angeles wore its post-war boom like a badge, but by the 1950s, the city was famous for something darker. Smog so thick, it stung the eyes. That first mystery gas in 1943 sent folks running, fearing poison. By the 50s, choking haze became part of daily life, until smog alerts warned school kids to stay inside. The interstate highway system broke ground in 1956, reshaping the country forever. But the price was steep. Whole neighborhoods, often poor or minority, were bulldozed to make way for cloverleafs and overpasses. Families watched homes vanish for concrete ribbons of progress. It brought America closer together, but for those in the path, it tore communities apart. Chrome ruled the 1950s driveway. Cars gleamed like rolling rocket ships, polished until the neighbors could see their reflections. On weekends, families dragged out buckets and sponges, scrubbing white walls and buffing hoods until they shined. A wax job wasn't just about the car. It was a ritual, a source of pride, and a way to show you were moving up. Gas in the early 1950s cost about 20 cents a gallon, around $2.25 today. A stop at the station wasn't just about fuel. Attendants rushed out in crisp uniforms, filled the tank, washed the windshield, checked the oil, even pumped up the tires. It was service with a smile, a free ritual baked into every fill-up. Step onto a 1950s New York subway car, and you wouldn't find air conditioning. Cars rattled along with ceiling fans whirring, windows flung open, hot wind blasting commuters in the face. Sweat and noise were part of the ride. Air-conditioned trains didn't come until the 1960s, making summers underground in the 50s almost unbearable by modern comfort standards. DDT fog trucks crawled through neighborhoods like parade floats. Kids chased them on bikes, riding straight through clouds of pesticide mist, laughing and waving at the driver. No masks, no warnings, just another summer thrill. Parents barely blinked. It was considered progress, the march of science keeping mosquitoes at bay. Department stores drew crowds to their Christmas windows every December. Behind glass, miniature trains puffed along tiny tracks. Lights twinkled on doll-sized houses, and Santa's elves hammered toys. Parents lifted kids onto shoulders to get a better look, crowds pressing against frosted glass. For many, those displays weren't just decoration. They were the real start of the holiday season. In the 1950s, government scientists cooked up Operation Plowshare, an idea that now sounds unthinkable. They wanted to use hydrogen bombs for peaceful construction, blasting out new harbors, carving canals, even flattening mountains for highways. On paper, it was progress. In reality, it was a nuclear fever dream. One more reminder of how casual people once were about atomic firepower. Fallout shelters were more than a newspaper illustration. Families were urged to stock basements with hand-cranked radios, dosimeters, flashlights, and canned peaches stacked high. Some built full bunkers, others simply moved food into the cellar and hoped for the best. It was a peculiar mix of Cold War fear and household preparedness. Survival plans tucked right between the laundry and the furnace. San Francisco's cable cars in the 1950s were more thrill-ride than transit, with no doors, no seatbelts, and tourists hanging off the side snapping photos. It felt like something between public transit and a carnival ride. Locals clung tight during sharp turns, bells clanging through the fog. A daily adventure that would make regulators sweat today. On the roads, hand signals lingered well into the 1950s. Drivers stuck arms out windows to signal turns, pointing left, right, or waving up and down for stop. Many older cars had no blinkers at all. By the early 50s, turn signals became standard on new models. But it was common to see a mix of both for years. Pittsburgh wore its steel crown proudly, but it came with a price. The city's sky was so thick with smoke from the mills that workers' white shirts turned gray walking just a few blocks. It wasn't smog, it was soot, and it coated everything. Folks joke that you could tell a man's trade by the color of his collar. Traffic death rates in the 1950s were staggering by modern measures. Cars lacked seatbelts, airbags, and crumple zones, but roads were filling fast with eager drivers. Per mile traveled, fatalities were several times higher than today. Newspapers carried daily accident tallies. But people still piled into cars, windows down, radio playing, believing freedom was worth the risk. Las Vegas in 1950 had fewer than 25,000 residents, but slot machines were everywhere, even in grocery stores and gas stations. Housewives could drop in a nickel while picking up bread. That ended in 1955, when Nevada banned slots outside casinos. For a short time, though, gambling really was on every corner of the desert boomtown. Car theft wasn't much of a worry in the early 1950s because car keys often weren't unique. One Chevy ignition key could sometimes start another Chevy down the street. Stories spread of people accidentally driving off in the wrong car, only realizing it later. Today, it sounds impossible, but back then, it was just another quirk of the road. Families in the 50s often covered their brand-new car seats with clear plastic slipcovers. In summer, they stuck to bare legs. In winter, they squeaked against wool coats. Nobody liked sitting on them, but everyone liked keeping the upholstery like new. It was an era when protecting an investment sometimes mattered more than enjoying it. The CIA's MK Ultra program began in the 1950s, a chapter that still shocks people today. Soldiers, prisoners, and even civilians were given LSD and other drugs, sometimes without their consent, all in the name of Cold War mind control experiments. It was secret, strange, and only decades later did the public begin to understand what had really happened. Detroit in the 1950s was booming, nicknamed the Arsenal of Democracy after the war. Its auto industry fueled the middle class. A factory job meant a good paycheck, a home, and money in the bank. New cars rolled off assembly lines, and so did optimism. The Motor City wasn't just thriving, it was the model for what American prosperity looked like. Cigarette ads in the 1950s didn't whisper about health. They shouted endorsements from doctors. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette, boasted one campaign. Smoking wasn't just common, it was everywhere, in homes, offices, hospitals, and restaurants. By the mid-1950s, over half of adult men smoked. It was considered normal, even stylish, despite the clouds in every room. Doctors in the 1950s prescribed amphetamines liberally, often marketed as diet pills or energy boosters. Housewives took pep pills to keep up with daily chores, while businessmen used them to push through long hours. Addiction risks weren't yet widely discussed. To many, it seemed like modern science delivering stamina in a pill, with little thought for tomorrow. Miami's booming suburbs in the 1950s came from swamps drained and tamed. Builders laid rows of pastel homes where alligators once roamed. Canals cut across backyards, mosquitoes swarmed, and hurricanes loomed, but families bought in anyway. For middle-class Americans, a slice of Florida sunshine felt like paradise, even if the land beneath was borrowed from the Everglades. In the 1950s, many banks flatly refused to give married women a mortgage or credit card without their husband's signature. It wasn't law. It was discrimination, and it was common. Women could have jobs, bank accounts, even savings, but when it came to credit, institutions treated them as dependents. It wasn't outlawed until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974. In classrooms, prayer and Bible readings were ordinary in the 1950s. Students bowed their heads each morning, and "Under God" was added to the pledge in 1954. By 1956, "In God We Trust" became the nation's official motto. For many, it felt natural. Today, it's hard to imagine such routines without lawsuits and headlines. Apartment buildings in the 1950s often burned their trash in basement incinerators. Each morning, superintendents shoveled refuse into roaring flames, sending smoke through chimneys into the city air. It was normal, even expected, though by today's standards it sounds reckless. To residents then, it was just another daily rhythm of city life, part of the smell of urban living. Atomic-age gadgets turned out to be a little too atomic. Luminous wristwatches glowed green from radium paint, uranium glass glowed under black light, and that brilliant orange Fiestaware glaze carried radiation. Folks used them daily without worry. Nobody thought twice about eating soup from a glowing bowl. It was modern science, bright and flashy. Progress you could set on the dinner table. Doctors still made house calls in the 1950s, black bag in hand, fee tucked into an envelope at the kitchen table. Medical charts were handwritten, malpractice suits were rare, and the relationship felt personal. Families trusted the doctor's word whether it was antibiotics or rest and fluids. It was a time when medicine came to your door instead of the other way around. Across America, volunteers scanned the skies with binoculars, part of the Ground Observer Corps. Many were retirees, teachers, or even school children perched in little towers with phones at the ready. Their job was to spot and report unknown aircraft to the Air Force, a Cold War precaution that feels almost quaint today. To many, it felt patriotic, even fun. Airline cabins in the 1950s were smoky, noisy places. Passengers lit cigarettes at their seats, ashtrays clinking as trays of coffee rattled down the aisle. Turbulent sent drinks sloshing and elbows bumping, but nobody complained or pulled out a lawsuit. Flying felt glamorous, but it was rough around the edges. Loud engines, thin cushions, and a free matchbook in every seat pocket. The GI Bill sparked a housing boom, filling America with new subdivisions of near-identical tract homes. Levittown became a symbol of post-war prosperity, with veterans and their families moving into neat rows of Cape Cods. Some prefabricated homes from the late 40s still stood, too, scattered reminders of rationing days. It was a time when the dream of home ownership felt widely within reach. In the early 1950s, a family could flip through a magazine, see a pistol or rifle ad, and order it through the mail, delivered right to the front door. No federal background checks, no paperwork, just cash in an envelope. Today it sounds impossible, but at the time it was simply commerce. Firearms sold like any other household product. Families piled into one car for road trips, no seatbelts, kids stretched across laps, the dog panting happily in the back, and windows cranked open wide. Hours ticked by with license plate games and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Somehow, it worked just fine. It was noisy, crowded, a little dangerous, but it was also the rhythm of American family vacations. Classrooms in the 1950s sometimes smelled faintly of chalk dust and tobacco smoke. Teachers read stories with a lit cigarette resting in an ashtray on the desk, occasionally tapping the ash between pages. Parents didn't complain. It was normal. The classroom felt authoritative, orderly, and familiar, even if the haze lingered long after the bell. It was a different kind of atmosphere, literally. Pressure cookers were advertised as miracle machines, promising meals in minutes. Housewives were encouraged to whip up roasts or soups faster than ever. But these early models had a reputation. Faulty seals sometimes turned supper into a small kitchen explosion. Despite the risk, they were staples of 1950s kitchens, part wonder, part worry, and another symbol of science making life easier. Girl Scouts sold cookies the old-fashioned way, lugging waxed paper boxes door to door, order sheets clipped to clipboards. Flavors were simpler then, mostly shortbreads and sandwich cookies. But the ritual mattered more than the variety. Neighbors bought a box or two, smiling at the girls in green sashes. It wasn't about marketing or online orders. It was about community. Before cable was a household word, some towns strung coaxial lines down hills for community antenna television. One tall antenna caught the broadcast signal. Then wires carried it to dozens of homes. People chipped in for the service, sharing a single signal as if it were a neighborhood well. It was a grassroots fix for families stuck in the TV dead zones. Neighbors trusted one another so much that many homes kept spare keys under doormats, flower pots, or even hanging from a nail inside the garage. It was understood that anyone who needed to borrow sugar or water the plants could let themselves in. Burglaries were rare in most towns, and the idea of hiding keys in plain sight seemed perfectly reasonable. Jell-O molds were the centerpiece of many 1950s dinner tables. It wasn't unusual to see meats, vegetables, or even hard-boiled eggs suspended in a colorful gelatin ring. What seems odd today was once the height of culinary fashion. Guests admired the shimmer, homemakers beamed with pride, and everyone dug in with a smile. To them it was modern elegance made edible. Housewives often kept coffee tins by the stove filled with bacon grease. Nothing went to waste. That jar of fat was used to fry eggs, biscuits, or even vegetables. The aroma of bacon carried through the week, stretching a Sunday breakfast into weekday meals. It was thrift, flavor, and tradition, all saved in a tin can by the burner. In many towns, grocery stores closed at noon on Wednesdays for half-day. Shopkeepers needed a break, and customers accepted it. Families planned errands around the rhythm, knowing the aisles would go dark midweek. In today's 24/7 America, the idea feels foreign. But in the 1950s, it was normal for communities to slow down, pause, and let shopkeepers breathe. Many home garages of the 1950s had open grease pits dug into the floor. They let car owners climb down and work beneath their vehicles without lifts or ramps. Kids sometimes played dangerously close, and accidents did happen. Eventually, safety codes banned them, but at the time, they were just another part of the American garage. Practical, messy, and risky. Coal was still king in working-class towns, and many homes had basement chutes that opened to the street. Delivery men dumped coal directly into bins below, filling homes with fuel for furnaces. Soot and dust coated everything, but the system worked. To a child, the coal chute often looked like a mysterious tunnel, one more corner of the house to explore. At diners, raw eggs weren't just for the griddle. Sometimes they were cracked right into milkshakes. Called egg creams or strength drinks, they were supposed to give a boost of protein. Nobody thought much about salmonella or pasteurization. The egg was simply part of the show, cracked with flair by a soda jerk and slurped down by eager customers. Shopkeepers often turned to neighborhood kids for odd jobs, sweeping sidewalks, stacking crates, or delivering small packages. Payment was usually a nickel or a dime, maybe even a free soda. It wasn't just pocket money, it was trust. Kids learned responsibility, merchants got a helping hand, and the arrangement stitched small towns together. Today, it would raise eyebrows, but then it worked. On late-night highways, it wasn't unusual for a patrol officer to stop a weaving driver and simply wave him home. The phrase, "sleep it off," carried more weight than cuffs and a booking. It was seen as a warning, not a crime. Today, the idea feels shocking. But back then, drunk driving often went home with a handshake instead of charges. Many early 1950s cars still relied on a starter button near the floorboard. Drivers pressed it with a foot to fire up the engine. By the middle of the decade, key start ignitions took over, but for a while, the mix of both was common. It was another small step in making cars feel more futuristic and convenient. Progress in the driver's seat. Rural hardware and farm supply stores sometimes sold dynamite caps and fuses, no license required. Farmers used them to blast tree stumps or break rocks in the field. A box might sit on a shed shelf alongside tools and nails. Today it sounds shocking, but in the 1950s it was seen as just another supply. Dangerous, yes, but ordinary. Every new car rolled out of the showroom with a cigarette lighter and a full-size spare tire. They were expected as basic as the steering wheel. Over time, both disappeared. Lighters gave way to cup holders, and spare tires shrank or vanished entirely. But in the 1950s, those features were standard. Another reminder of how much priorities in cars have shifted. Many schools in the 1950s burned their trash on site, either in incinerators tucked in the basement or barrels set out back. Paper, lunch trays, and even broken furniture went into the flames. The smoke drifted across playgrounds, blending with chalk dust and coal soot. Nobody thought much of it. Waste pickup was less reliable, and burning seemed practical. In the early 1950s, plenty of families still rented freezer lockers at the local butcher shop. It was the only way to store meat in bulk. Families drove over with paper-wrapped cuts, unlocking their private compartment like a bank vault. By the late 50s, home freezers became common, and the practice faded. But for a time, frozen food lived at the butcher's.